Every year on this second Sunday of Easter, we hear the same story. The reading that tells the story of Thomas doubting the resurrection of Jesus. And while we all know the story, we know the beatitude that Jesus gives at the end, "Blessed are those who have not seen and still believe." It is also an important example to all of us, because at no point does Jesus say Thomas isn't blessed, or at least the opposite of blessed, that he's condemned for having doubted. And that's something I see quite often as a priest. People come to me, either in and out of confession, they come to me with great concern that they are doubting their faith, as if it is a sin or some kind of spiritual deficiency that they suffer from. To which I always like to remind them of this story, in which Thomas doubted, and without his doubting, we would not have the phrase of Jesus, the beatitude that says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and still believe." In another part, earlier on in the Gospel of John, it is Thomas who raises the question, "Lord, we don't know where you are going. How can we know the way?" If Thomas had not asked that question, we would not have the answer. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And so we learn from Thomas, doubting your faith is not necessarily a sin. Having doubts is not necessarily a bad thing, because doubts lead to questions. Questions lead to answers, and answers lead to a deepening of faith. At least the correct answers do. If the answers lead us away from our faith, then those could be considered the wrong answers. And if they are successful in leading us away from our faith, then there is where the sacrament of confession is needed. But simply doubting is not. Imagine the scandal it must have been to address something so basic as the resurrection of Jesus. And we know the reason John includes it in his gospel is not just simply because it perhaps had happened among the apostles, but was also an issue among the early church that needed to be addressed in a gospel written in the last decade of the first century, at least for the community of John. We don't see this story in the other gospels. But perhaps in the early decades of the church, there were people who were asking that very question to the most basic part of our faith. How are we to know that Jesus is risen? And we have that answer. We have other theologians all throughout our history, of which Thomas the Apostle could be considered the first theologian, in which questions about the faith, expansions of our faith, how do we apply our faith, were asked, and in some cases brought up because of doubts in application of the faith throughout history. But some of our greatest theologians are great because they asked those questions and they gave those, and they produced those answers. Sometimes they sought the answers in the Scriptures, but also they sought the answers in the tradition of the church, the tradition of the teaching, the declarations of the Holy Fathers and the church councils, to come to a grasp on what the church teaches with regard to various circumstances and situations. And one of the greatest of them is another saint named Thomas, who's also called Aquinas, whose answers fill 17 volumes, called the Summa Theologica. And so, don't be afraid to doubt your faith. Don't be intimidated if you experience doubts, because doubts lead to questions. Questions lead to answers, and answers, the correct answers, lead to a deepening of our faith. One example we perhaps could see is an issue that rises from our first reading today. It's almost a telltale passage that is very relevant, or many people like to make it relevant today in the socio-political debates that we have, in which it speaks of the early church that says the community of believers was of one heart and mind, and no one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but they had everything in common. If I had a nickel for every time in this day and age someone comes up to me and asks me, "Well, Father, doesn't that mean the Catholic Church, or at least the Bible, advocates socialism and communism?" There is where I become the doubter. very skeptical of the question, of the interpretation, but perhaps it's because of my own bias, living in a capitalistic society, at least for now, and having been raised in those principles to have that interpretation brought forth to me. So I have my doubts, like Thomas. And so I looked in the Scriptures. And it seems a little bit counter to other parts of the Scriptures, such as when God says to the people of Israel before they take the promised land, them having been slaves working for a Pharaoh, and the fruit of their labor was for an overseeing overlord of the Pharaoh, God assures them, you will have your own land, you will till your own soil, you will sow and reap your own crops, and you will sleep under your own fig tree. A very much a counterpoint to the experience of slavery and the overlord, overseer of the Pharaoh. In another place, when the people say, we want a king, they are warned, if I give you a king, if you have a king, he will take the fruit of your labor. He will take your sons for his armies. He will take your women for his work. He will take the fruit of your labor to build his palaces and his barricades. But at the same time, I suppose the skepticism would still be there, because in many places, the Scriptures do appear to contradict themselves. And in many, unfortunately, many cases, one can justify anything, including some very bad things, by misquoting the Scriptures. So I thought, let's look at the tradition of Catholic social teaching. And not only did I find the answers, but in those answers you find something very relevant to the saint we are celebrating this year as a church throughout the world. Saint Joseph, the husband of Mary, the legal father of Jesus, and the patron saint of the universal church. Pope Leo XIII in the late 1800s wrote an encyclical that has become the measuring rod for Catholic social teaching. And in that encyclical, he too reiterates what we read in the Scriptures when he says, if we are to maintain the value of human labor and the dignity of human work as an expression of human dignity, then we must maintain the virtue of private property. And the values of socialism must be rejected because it diminishes the individual for a collective and the human dignity that goes with working for a living. 40 years later, in Quadragesimo Anno, Pope Pius XI reiterates what Rerum Novarum said, to the point that he says very simply, Catholic socialism is a contradiction in terms. One cannot be a Catholic and a socialist at the same time. In a subsequent encyclical, Divini Redemptoris, written at a time in the 1930s in which we saw the rise of a particular kind of socialism called communism, and the rise of atheism that is associated with it, Pope Pius XI specifically calls on Saint Joseph for patronage in the efforts against the rise of communism and its atheistic ideologies that was on the rise throughout the world at the time. Saint Joseph himself is called upon in prayer to emulate the virtues of Christianity and the dignity of work, to counter the values of socialism and communism. And then, in the mid-50s, Pope Pius XII declared a feast day on May 1st of Saint Joseph the Worker, because May 1st, while at one time a secular festival holiday, had been sabotaged, if you will, by the communists as a day of celebrating communism, but we celebrate it in Joseph as a day that lifts the virtue and dignity of the worker as a Christian virtue, as a counter to that social and economic ideology. As a result of that, and I kid you not, as a result of that, devotion to Joseph increased, in which more and more he was called upon as Joseph, the terror of demons. We've heard homilies in this year about Joseph being the terror of demons and the evil influences that seek to pull us away from the gospel, and evil influences that seek to diminish human dignity. And Joseph, terror of demons, was invoked to counter the rise and influence of socialism and communism. There's where I found my answer. In the tradition of church social teaching, of Catholic social teaching. But it began with a simple skepticism of people interpreting this passage in the first reading in a way that is perhaps very relevant and very much a topic of debate and conversation today in the socio-economic realms and social economic contexts. But we must not be intimidated by our doubts and our questions. Seek those answers. Learn what our faith entails. Because doubts lead to questions, questions lead to answers, and answers lead to a deepening of faith, and in my case, a greater appreciation of the very saint that we are honoring this year as a church throughout the world. Saint Joseph, the worker, Saint Joseph, terror of demons, just in my investigating that one question that arose from some people's interpretation of the passage we hear in our first reading. So what are your questions? What have been your doubts? Seek those answers in the Scriptures, in church teaching, in the catechism, in church tradition of the councils of the church, the writings of the saints, the fathers and doctors of the church. In 2,000 years of applying the faith we profess in the risen Jesus to all circumstances, everywhere, throughout all of history, we can apply that faith by simply raising the questions of how, just as Thomas answered that today. How am I to know he is risen if I have not seen him for myself? Jesus says, blessed are those who have not seen and still believe. And we would not have had that answer if Thomas had not brought up the question. What will be the answers we discover as we deepen our faith and learn more about the history and the teachings of our church? Because when all is said and done, Thomas is not the doubter. He is Thomas, the theologian. Because doubts lead to questions. Questions lead to answers. And answers lead to a deepening of our faith.